Okay, cool. Welcome back. Early on, we were talking a little bit about Angular. We saw how to set up Angular on a computer and generate the new application and how to pretty much play around with some of the basic construct of an Angular application, right? What I want to talk about right now are the concept of services. But before we get onto that, I want to address one important part of an Angular application, which is the modules, right? So every single Angular application that you guys will be building needs to have at least one module defined for it to work. And what the module does, if I show you what this is what the module file looks like, right? And what it pretty much does is that it imports other modules that are available that are defined as part of either the Angular library or some third-party libraries that you might want to use in your application, for instance. Um, so if you recall from earlier on, in order for us to make use of the form capabilities of Angular, I had to import the form modules that pretty much brings in all the directives and all the components that we need in order to interact with forms using Angular. And the way to do that was to include the form modules, which is coming from the Angular forms library, right, into our module files. And we had to make sure that in this block here, in this ng module block, which is what make so this blocks here define all the modules that will be available to the application. So importing it here is not enough. You still need to make sure that it is defined as part of this ng module section, right? So I then had to add the form module here, making it finally available to the application. Um, in the declaration sections, uh, here you will often list things like your components or any other directives or uh, you know pipes or whatever custom thing you define as part of your application needs to be declared in this array. You can see that when we define earlier on when I generated the video suggestion component, it was automatically added by the generator in those declaration sections. Okay. Um, the providers sections and the bootstrap, we will talk about that later, but just keep this file in mind. Whenever you need to add a new service or a new library to your application, you need to make sure that if it is a module, you need to make sure that the module is first imported here and that it is part of the imports section of your module. For your components, you need to make sure that the components are always declared as always part of the are always part of the declarations array in those ng modules. Okay, so that's for the modules. Now let's talk about services. So what are services and what do we use them for? Pretty much services are sort of like ways to interact with data sources in general. Okay, so if you want to interact with an external API, for instance, to collect some information, um, you will often do that through a services. Okay, so the service will be responsible for making all the calls um, to the API and then returning you the data for you to make use of in your application. You can also use that to do things like validating user inputs on the form, so you can generate the service that will be responsible for checking in any action on the form and telling you whether or not the data that you provide is correct. Okay, but let's see that in action. Kind of. I'm just gonna work with an existing application. So we have an API that we built for a demo a couple of weeks back. I'm going to use that API to sort of like illustrate this concept. Okay. Let me see if I can get the link to that API so we can see what kind of information we get from that. Right. All right. Okay. So let's see here. Facebook. Let's see if this thing is working. Well, if it doesn't work, maybe we use movies. What do you say, Sophie? Hi, it works.
I say yes.
Okay, but we're gonna build an address book instead. Well, so this works. We have some data that we're getting from here, and what we want to do is that we want to display that information as part of this application, right? So what I'm gonna do is pretty much gonna erase all of this, and I'm gonna bring up some boilerplate code. I'm not going to bore you by typing all of it. I'm just going to paste that in there and walk you through what's going on here. Okay, so here we have a component called ngContainer that is defined as part of the Angular library. It pretty much defines a container that will be rendered on the page, right? So we're going to use this, and we're still using our good old friend ng-for directive, which is used to iterate over collection of data. And we are, in this case, iterating over the data, some data object that is supposed to have contacts in it, right? And inside of it, we have this div here that displays a card for every contact that we have. And what we are displaying is pretty much the contact image and some informations of that person. Okay. We're making use of expressions here to render the content for every variable that we are getting. Okay. Now, how do we actually get this data that we want to display on the page? Now, in order to do that, I could easily so if I remove, let's remove this code that we had before. Right. So this as well can go away. Pretty much what we want to have is a data object that has contacts in it, right? So I could potentially, if we look at this one, we have data. Let's see if we have the raw data here. So I could probably just copy pretty print. That's cool. I'm just going to copy maybe 2 of these. And we're going to add that to this. So we're going to define a data variable type any. It's going to be equal to that. Right. And it's not happy about something. Should be quote mark. Yeah, well, want quote marks all over the place. We're not gonna care about it. It's not a biggie. TS is expecting. We have an array that's closing there. I need to close that array. I close that. Right. So that's that. Now the problem with what I just did now is that in my view here, I'm looking for an object called contact on that data. But right now I have a string, so this is not going to fly. I'm going to quickly modify this. I'm quick enough. And go, get rid of that. Okay. That's fine. Now we have a JavaScript object. Let's get rid of those errors for a while. Okay, cool. Yeah, you see now it doesn't work with this because I need to escape this. But yeah, this should work. So now we have that in place. If I go back to this, still compiling, I guess. And let's refresh this page. Okay. Add component. Let's see if we are indeed getting something out of that. So I've defined the data. My constructor. So for every component that you create, the constructor, if you define a constructor here, whatever code you put in this constructor is going to be executed the first time you sort of like make use of that component. So the first time that component is rendered on the page, it executes this bit here. So I'm going to console log the data. See if we get something. So we have that. Right. So we have object data. Great. The reason why it's not displaying anything is because I expect data to have contact in it. Do we have contact? No, we don't have contact. Okay, so let's just say data. And we should have something. Get a different error. Cannot find a differ supporting object of type. Right, so this needs to be an iterable object. What are we getting here for data? App component. No, I don't want to see the diffs. I want to see the files. Right. Oh. Okay, this should do it. Dot context. And we have it. Okay, cool. So now we have something displayed there. If we inspect this, why do we have empty cards? The image has nothing in it. We have no names. That's not cool. Let me see if I can, within here, display contacts. Right. Okay. So we have contacts and then we have attributes. Right. So it needs to be contact. So for every contact, we have attribute. And there we have it. Okay. Right. So what I did now is that we have the data that we want to display. Okay. And we pretty much iterate over all that information and display that onto our web page, right? Now, how do we, in this context here, it's fine if you have like one or two to pretty much just create an object like this here with that. But we want to get more of these contacts sort of like returned to us, right? And we know that we have this API endpoint that returns us more than just a single items, right? So, but before we get that, I'm just gonna clean that thing a little bit to make it look proper. So I'm going to add some CSS to it. So we'll grab all the CSS and we'll add that to the app component CSS. Where is that? It's here. Do this. Okay, nothing fancy. We have everything displayed the way we want it. Cool. Why is this attribute? Great. Okay, so this works fine. In order for us to sort of like get more of these informations, we need to read this from the API. And you've been playing around with APIs for the past few weeks now, so you consume API information on a Ruby or a Rails application. What I'm going to show you now is how to do that for an AngularJS application. The concept and the process are the same. You still need to make your same GET request to read information on the API. You still need to make the same POST request to create information onto the API and so on. But you do that making use of the same way we had libraries to do that in Ruby. We have libraries to do that in Angular as well, right? So we are going to need an HTTP library to be able to make those requests. So I'm going to import in my app module here. I'm going to import the HTTP module from Angular HTTP. Make sure that I add that to my import section.
You kind of misspelled Angular.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right, okay. So once we do this, I then need to head over to my component. And in my component, because I now imported this one, in my component, I need to, where's the source code for the component? Let's go back here. So here I need to import, so this one doesn't belong here. I have to import HTTP and response because we need to process that response from the server. So we import this from Angular HTTP as well. Okay. And I'm gonna need library to manipulate the result that I get from that request. So map library. Okay, so I need the map functions for processing that. You'll see how we make use of that in a moment. Okay. Now, in my controller, what I want to do is that the first time I get to this application, I want to perhaps call contact. Call on this method. And what this method will do is pretty much make the request to the server. So here, what we do is that the response is going to be equal to, right, no, I can't do it like that. I have to say this HTTP get, and what's the API URL? Okay, so let's bring that over. So I'm going to define that API URL here. We have this API URL. Let's remove the private keyword. That's not so relevant here. Okay, so we're gonna make a GET request to API URL, and the response we get from that, we're going to use the map method to process that response. So whatever we receive here should be of type response, and those data should be equal to, actually, let me just console log for now. Response to JSON. And semicolon. Now it is complaining here that HTTP does not exist on the type app component. This is because I haven't declared that this HTTP module so that I can make use of it in this application. We did import the HTTP module, but we need to do something else to start using it. And it's called dependency injection. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I need to do is pretty much include that library. So create a new HTTP object of type HTTP. So when I do this, I'm basically injecting all the HTTP functionality that is defined here into this component, right? So because of that, I can now call on some of the method that this module provides, right? Okay, let's see if this works. If this works, we should get this response. So we make a GET request to that URL, and whatever we get from that URL, we pass that to a map method. So map works the same way as all the other map method that you've used either in Ruby or any other languages before. It takes a collection, because this one will return your collection, and it takes that collection and modifies it. So I'm going to add some code later on to modify that collection, right? So, but let's see what we get right now if we run this. Nothing happens. Interesting. So if I, perhaps let's change the way I'm doing this. Yeah, so whatever it returns here, I want you to convert that to JSON. Let's return that to this guy and this data. Get contact, subscribe. So whatever we get here, we can console log that to the terminal, to the console. Right. So you saw that when we get to the page, after a while, this gets printed here. So if we pull that up, we can see we get all the contacts from the API. Okay. So what's happening here is that we make the request in this map functionality, whatever we receive, because this thing here is pretty much a text document. If you look at this, this is a text document that's get returned to us, right? So what I'm doing here is that I'm converting that text document, the response body that we got here, into a JSON object that we can process in this application, right? Now, map function return what we call observable. We're going to talk about observable in the course of the week, but pretty much everything in JavaScript is done asynchronously, especially when we have to make requests to external servers and stuff like that. So when we fire up this request here, the program continues the execution and just does whatever else it has to do. And then when we get a response from the server, it then has to do something with that response. So this is what we're doing here with the subscribe method. pretty much when we're sending this thing off, we need to somewhere subscribe to it. And the subscribe method, what it does is that it basically watches for a response from this one. If it gets a response for it, it will then print the results in this block here, because we are just doing console log here, right? So we made a request to the server, we get that data, and then we just print that out in the console log. That's why when I refresh this, we don't see that appear immediately, right? It takes a little while for the result to appear here. Okay, so now instead of putting this here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the hard-coded values that we had before. So we're just going to define that variable here. And after doing that, we're going to have an empty page, of course. To fix that, we'll do say this data is equal to, we take the data that we get from the response of the API, and then we shove that into this variable. And if all works well, we should see more than just one card displayed there. So this needs to be data.data. Rather, let's call this response. Response. Or not. Response has data in it. Right. Let's see what we have in response data. Okay, we get an array of objects. What does an object look like? We have attributes. So data is undefined. Okay. Right, so we have data. Let's print the first one. I'm going to comment out this view for now. Let's see what we get. Okay, we get an object that has some attributes in it. So we should be able to print right. Okay. The reason why this is not working is because, of course, the structure of the response that I'm getting is different from what I had initially. When we print response.data, we immediately get the array of contact, right? So I don't need to do data.contact anymore. So with that, I'll get all the contacts from that. Okay. So what we just did now is that we read from the API. We read from the API, and then we were able to display these values here. All right. Now this works all fine, but usually you don't want to have this kind of logic within your component. So whenever you're making requests to an external API like this, you probably want to create a service where you're going to move this code into. Okay, so we're going to do that in just a moment. If we go back to the terminal, yeah, we saw that we could also use this generator to generate services, right? So I'm going to generate a new service here that's called, because the service is responsible for handling contact, so I'm going to call that contact. right, ng generate service. Generates it generates these files. I'm going to move that to a service folder just to keep things clean a little bit. I'm going to create the folder called services, and I'm going to move these two files that was generated by the generator in here. Yes, I want to move them. Move this one as well. Yes. Okay. So pretty sure after generating that, okay, do I need something else? No, that's fine. Right, let's see. Okay, it didn't update any file, so it just generated those two. So what I need to do now, if we have a look at the service that was generated for us, let's close that, and let's close this and that one. Okay. Contact service. We have a constructor here, and what it does is that it defines a class called contact service, and we import the injectable module from Angular core. What this pretty much says is that we can inject this class here into other component in order to make use of them. Okay, and you'll see now when I need to make use of this service into the application. But in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, if I want to make a request to get all articles, for instance, and I create a method that's going to be responsible for doing just that. Okay. Later on, if you need to, you need other method that will interact with the article model, for instance. Talking about articles now, we are talking about contacts. See, I've done too much articles last week already. So get contacts will get all the contact. We'll use that to get all the contact. If we want to create or get a single contact, we can define extra methods or functions in here that will be responsible for doing just that. Okay. But for now, what I need to do is simply, I'm going to import the HTTP and response. Yeah. So it did that for me. So I'm just going to import HTTP now. And we will, from here, get this one as well. Okay, we need that one. Now, the logic that I had in here, I can now move this outside of this component or controller, if you prefer, and just add that in here. So we're pretty much doing the same thing that we did before. And here I need to inject the HTTP module. Okay. Now, because of this, I can define my API URL to be this. Right. So let's grab this. We're gonna put that here. And lastly, we will have to, okay, in order for us to make use of this method inside of any other component, right, we need to inject it in here. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna make this a private thing as well. And I'm gonna call this contact service type contact services. It should import that for me. Good. So what it does is that we import the contact services from the services file that we've defined as part of this project, right? And then we inject that in here. And now what I can do is use this injected method or object, see this contact service. And this contact service I can now call the get contacts, right? Which now replaces so it now replaces the call that we had before. Okay, so we now do contact services, get contacts, etc. The advantage of extracting this logic into a service allows us to kind of reuse this code across the application. So perhaps we want to have access to the contacts in different components in the application, rather instead of just the app component. You know, we could easily inject that service into the component where we want to make use of it, and pretty much do the same stuff with it. Okay. Now let's see why this is not provider for contact service. Now this is where the provider section for your module comes into play. We need to add here, every service that you create as part of your application needs to be defined or listed in the provider section here. Okay, so we now need to add contact services. I'm going to use this nice feature to import that. So it does that. And when we save that, it should solve our problem or not. We get an error. Property API URL does not exist in contact service. Let's see. Right. Line 12, this API URL. See. Oh, I can't do this. Close. And let's okay. Yeah. And we can see that it still works the same. Okay. So as I was saying, we can now, if we have a different component that where we want to use this, we can simply in the constructor of that component inject the service and call all the functions that we need on that service. It helps us keep our component implementation a little bit cleaner, and it allows for the reuse of code as well. Okay, so there we have it. I'm going to do one more refactoring before we all split up. Is we can see that all these cards that we see here, if we follow the component architecture, we can pretty much create a component that that kind of like represent an address card, right? So I could simply ng generate component. We're going to call that contact card. And what's going to happen in that contact card is the following. Send Right, so what I want to do is that in this component, right, so we have this, and we expect this component to pretty much receive contact information. So we should have like contact information here. Is equal to some kind of object. And now we will move the template that we have here in. So what represents a component is this whole card right here. And we're going to put that in the template for that. So contact card works. Let's remove that and put this. Okay. Right. Let's put a semicolon here. Now I'm going to move. So what I'm going to be doing here is comment out this for now. And we're going to have empty. No. I need to go into the app component and remove this section. But instead, what we want to do is say app. What do we call this? What is the selector for that component? Selector for this component is app contact card, right? So in the app component, we're going to use that instead. So app, oops, app contact card, like this. And we want to give it a value, right? The value that we want to pass here is going to be the contact. So let's see. Right, so okay, so we're going to send in a contact here. I'm going to fix this in a second. Okay, for now it's just going to print at, and so on. So, okay. Right, so now in my app component, contact component, what I need to do is say contact. It's going to be input. This. And on my template, what I can now do, let's remove this one for now. Say that contact is equal to contact. Can't bind contact since it isn't a non-property of that one. So what did I do wrong this time again? Interesting. Right. So we have contact that we're getting from data, and I want to iterate. I get that, and I send that here. Contact, and in my component, I have this guy, which takes metadata directive, so it's not the right. Okay, so this, I want to import input from Angular core. There we have it. Okay. So, okay. So by putting this input thing on this variable that I've defined here, what it pretty much allows me to do is pass in, so I can easily use data binding to bind the contact attribute on this element to some data like this, right? So I'm getting the contact here, binding it to this contact attribute here, and because this is marked as an input, it will make this value available to this component, and we can use that to render the contact component the way we do it here. Now we still have one problem, is the fact that the styling is a little bit messed up. Remember what I said earlier on regarding styling, is that styling is something that is local to a given component, right? So in order to fix this, I need to make sure that I define some styling for that specific component. So all the styling that we had initially in the app component that were supposed to be the cards styling, I need to move them into that. Okay, so location is also part of that. I'll move that in here. No, this is the wrong one. Don't save. Contact, where are you? Put that in there. You can see that it's starting to get some shape. I still have some styling that is missing from there. We have, let's see what markups we have here. So we have a div content. I think I already took that. We have h1, h2, and p tags. So I need to grab that as well. So this goes into the styling, and we're back to working state on our application. Okay. Now, because we have this contact card component, right? We can pretty much reuse that anywhere in our application and just make sure that we pass in a contact the way we did it here, right? We need to bind it to some contact, and then it'll render that contact for you. Okay. So that is it for my demo today.
Thank you very much.
Question, comment, anything? Nothing. Right.
No, yeah. When especially like in the second part, one point you say that, like, for example, the right section of a YouTube page where you have like the video suggested and stuff, you say that it could be like different components put together. So one is for the video, one is for the comments, one is for the rating, something like that. But like, how do you actually organize that in your either index or like in the component page? Like, is it nested, and even if it is, like, how do you decide like what goes where, in that case?
So in this example with the contact page, for instance, what I did is that I have a root component that is defined here. We have this app root component in the index.html, right? And if we look back into this, so this section here in my application represents this entire page, kind of. Okay, so this entire section here, that's my root component, right? So I can pretty much put in whatever I want as part of this. Okay, so and that's what I did here. If we look at the template for this, this is where we're rendering the contact card that we have here. So contact card are children of this app component, which is the root here, right? So root template, we specify children template. The children template here is the contact card app, right? That we are rendering here. You should also be able to, let me see if we can do that. So if I go on and say, let me think about this for a minute. We have this component here. And because it is part of the modules, we have contact card component. Let's see. Fine. My HTML. What did I call it? Contact card. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do. In this section here, I'm gonna use directive called ngIf. See if we have a contact. Do that. And p tag contact. And we're gonna do ngIf equals to, I think we can do this. Now with this, should have, let's scroll to the bottom of the page. Okay, so it doesn't display anything because I have that in here. So if we put that in here, still nothing. App card component. Okay, I'm gonna have to play around with this. What I wanted to do is kind of like try to use one of those component here outside of the root component that we define for our application, but it's not giving me the results that I want. But I'm gonna play around with this and just get back to you on that, Francesco.
Sure,
Okay.
thanks.
Right. Right. So here's what you guys are gonna do from now on. The material has been released. I will send you the video recording for this section. But I want you guys to go over this text that we provide you here. Make sure that you set up everything properly. Read about the Angular modules. Read about the components again. We have some questions that we've drop down for you. So as you're going through every section of these of this material, I want you guys to, because you're going to generate an application at the beginning after you've installed here, right? And then I'd like the questions pretty much get you guys to navigate through the folder structure of an Angular application, get yourself acquainted with the structure, and generate a couple of components. We have some explanation about metadata and like a couple of exercises on how to make use of data binding and stuff, right? So whenever I know we have some questions along the way, so I'd like you guys to answer to those questions and share your answers through a Git repository. So for this dummy project that you will create, I'd like you guys to create a repository for it and push the code to that. And you can refer to the video to sort of like implement this whole service thing that I did with the contact API example. Okay, so that's what I want you guys to spend the time working on this week. First of all, go through all these content and try to re-implement the contact thing that I just did now. The slides here have part of the code for that. This is the CSS style, the HTML document, the component, and pretty much the stuff that I had to do initially to get the API, but the refactoring part of it is not part of the slides. Okay. So yeah, that's your assignment for the rest of the afternoon.
Okay.
If you get stuck, I'm on Slack. I'll be there to answer your questions.